the African Free Trade Area, for example, can add to the trade in Africa $3.4 trillion, yes? And that depends on Africa. It doesn't depend on the US. You know, so the self-reliance of Africa is not only aid, it's also economic growth.
Trade channels have been the colonial trade channels between us and Europe and not amongst ourselves. So one of the things we need to deal with first is how we develop the infrastructure to be able to exchange goods amongst ourselves. Already, most countries are allowing free movement of people. And so if we have free movement of goods and services across the continent, I think that it will fill a huge gap in South-South trade, and that will benefit all our countries.
And I think that what's important is for us to agree that this is a moment for a design of what would enable us enjoy the collaborations and the cooperations that we know really helped the global prosperity that we saw for many decades, even this last century. There is an opportunity for a multilateral system, but it has to be a different kind of multilateral system. Well, Trump is forcing it on us to have that debate, and it has started here. That's why I love town halls.
Thank you very much.
This is the journey to One Africa.
Thank you, Jochen. Thank you, Wolfgang. I'm delighted to be here to start to moderate this opening conversation, which I do think has an apt title, certainly the beginning of it, Building or Burning Bridges. I do think we are in a moment where that kind of scale of dramatic language is apt. Just think about the last 3 weeks. A new administration in the US has, I think, upended geopolitics in fairly fundamental ways. First of all, with very different approaches in conflict areas. I think about the Middle East, I think about Ukraine. Secondly, about very different ideas of what the global trading system should look like and use of tariffs. And thirdly, as you mentioned, Wolfgang, with the shuttering of USAID and a fundamental, it seems, different approach to foreign assistance. So I think in the short term, we've had a big shake-up. And I think that is something we should discuss. And we should then discuss what are the risks from this, but also what are the opportunities. What is the right way to respond to this fairly dramatic shaking up of the status quo? And to do that, we have a fantastic group of people. And I will briefly introduce President John Dramani Mahama, the newly elected, newly inaugurated President of Ghana. Congratulations, Mr. President. In front of me, behind you, on this side of the town hall, is Rebecca Greenspan, Secretary General of the United Nations Trade and Development Organization in Geneva, one of the bastions of the UN. Very nice to see you. And here, a man who needs no introduction to many of you, Celso Amorim, now Chief Advisor to the President, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. Very nice to see you. And when he gets through security, we will be joined by José Manuel Álvarez Bueno, who is the Foreign Minister of Spain. So we have very interesting and different perspectives. And I think we should start our conversation on the short term, and then we can move to the longer term. So, Mr. President, I want to start with you and ask you, what is the impact in Africa of the Trump administration's decisions, particularly the decisions on USAID? The short-term impact, how is it going to affect you? And what do you think it means for your continent?
Well, thank you, Zani. And let me say I'm probably a recycled president. I was president before. I lost the election, was in opposition for eight years, and I just came back. Maybe like Trump.
Like Lula.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. It's the story of our time.
So before I boarded the flight to come to Munich, I issued a directive to our Minister of Finance to make adjustments in our budget to take up the slack from the disruption in US aid funding. It amounts to $156 million for 2025. In our local currency, that's a bit above 2 billion cedis. It goes into 4 main areas: governance and democracy, healthcare, economic growth, and the fourth one is education. Now, the most critical is health, because it goes into maternal and child health. It covers PEPFAR activities. That includes HIV testing and provision of antiretrovirals and all that, and other support in the health care space. And that amounts to, the biggest chunk of it is about $78 billion or so. And so we're going to make adjustments in the budget. Happily, when we have elections, we don't present the budget until the new government takes over. And so we're supposed to present the budget in March. So it's possible for us to make provision to cover what the shortfall in U.S. assistance is going to be. I believe that it's adversity and opportunity. It must teach Africa to become more self-reliant. This goes to help the most vulnerable in our society. And so in making those adjustments, we must learn how to take care of our vulnerable and make sure that they're able to be included in the growth that is taking place. I think that the U.S. played a very critical role in the post-world order, and that post-world order has benefited the whole globe, including the U.S. The U.S. has prospered from the post-World War order, but it's gotten to a stage where it wants to recalibrate, and it has a right to recalibrate. But I believe that the recalibration should be in a less disruptive manner than it is happening now. One of the things that the U.S. is going to lose is that soft power that it has wielded in the world. I mean, these are people who are grateful for the kind of assistance that they get. And so for U.S. to decide that, no, we don't want to have anything to do with it anymore, then they lose some of that soft power. But it means that there are many other partners. U.S. are not our only partners, and so we'll continue to collaborate with other countries. And that's why we have a multipolar world. We are no longer a unipolar world. And so as bridges are burning, new bridges are being formed. And we need to look for those new bridges and be able to link the world on those new bridges.
Well, that's an admirably clear-headed reaction to something very dramatic that I can't imagine you were expecting. I want to hone in on one bit of that before I broaden it, which is the impact on US soft power and the speed with which you build other connections. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, like I said, US is very well admired in a lot of the developing world, you know, for the kind of assistance that it gives, for its presence in many theaters. And so if it decides that it's withdrawing, I think that there are many other countries that can fill the gap. But aside from filling the gap, I think that it sends a signal to Africa that the time has come for us to be more self-reliant when it comes to issues to do, especially with the vulnerable in our society. We should roll out more safety nets. We must go for more equitable societies, bridge the gap between the rich and the poor, and put out opportunities for our young people to be able to make a life for themselves.
So that's an opportunity for you to reshape away from, I'm going to put it crudely, aid dependence to a much more self-started approach.
I think so.
Interesting. Celso Amorim, when you heard of the decision on USAID, you are a long-standing diplomat. First of all, how surprised were you? And secondly, what do you think the consequences will be of this very abrupt shift in direction?
Well, I don't know if I'm very experienced, but I'm really an old diplomat, and that keeps us from surprises. But I think the decisions that have been taken recently, the USAID, but also the tariffs imposed on other countries, are not very welcome. I think there is, in this very interesting book about multipolarization that was given by the organization, there is an interesting sentence. It says, we in relation to developing countries, whether our preference is for the respecting of the rules. What do we really want? Respect of the rules or change of the rules? We want both. So that's the simple answer, which I would say. So we need to change some rules in order to make it more South-South cooperation. For instance, rules, not only those that are written, but the practices, more South-South cooperation, less money for armament, more money for food security, for climate. So this is the change of the rules. But as long as the rules don't change, we want respect for the old rules because we adapted to those rules. For instance, Brazil was a strong supporter of the creation of UNCTAD precisely because that the old GATT was a developed country, rich countries club. So, but and now these rules, which are more or less the same of the GATT with some adaptation in WTO, they have to be respected. So you have to have a place where you can send your disputes, where they can be judged fairly according to the rules, so that we avoid a trade war, which would be bad for everyone. So, in a summary, that's it.
Do you think we are on the path to a trade war? How is Brazil proposing to react to the imposition of tariffs?
Well, we try always negotiation. I mean, of course, these, for instance, the particular case of Brazil, the first attack, so to say, onslaught, was on steel. Well, many of the industries in the United States depend on the steel they buy from Brazil, so they are our allies. So we're talking to them to see if we can come to some negotiation. Negotiation is always better. But if it doesn't work, then we have to see what we can do. In the past, we would go to the WTO and ask for the dispute settlement mechanism to solve. But unfortunately, the US, that was in the first Trump government, but in a way it was weakening before already. Doesn't work, so we have to think. Maybe we can coordinate with other countries that are hit in the same way.
So, Rebecca, this system seems to be under, I think it's more than just attack, actually. I don't have to be diplomatic like Wolfgang does. I mean, it seems to me that this old system is dead. And the world that UNCTAD was there to police has been radically shaken up and probably is not coming back. How do you then react to that?
Well, two reactions first. We were not happy with the system. But as Celso says, we wanted the rules to be respected because it's worse to not have a system than to have a system that you want to change. We have a system that we want to change, but not having a system is worse for everybody. So this is my first reaction. So there were things that needed to change, and I think that we have to recognize that part of the discontent comes from reality. People are not happy. So something has to change in terms of the global economy to be more inclusive. Now, let me just cool a little bit the funeral that you have proposed.
I'm provoking you to have a discussion.
And say that still today, 80% of trade is happening under rules, under the WTO rules or under the free trade or bilateral or regional agreements. 80% of trade is still there. And we have two things that have shaken the world in concrete terms. That is the steel tariff and the 10% tariff on China. The rest has not happened yet.
But it's been announced, right?
But we don't know if it's a negotiation, if there will be a negotiation or not. If there is a negotiation, we are in a different position. If there will be a unilateral imposition of the reciprocity that yesterday Trump announced as a study, that will really go to the heart of the system that we have today. Because reciprocity in the WTO is that you give the same treatment to everybody when you decide to give it to one country. And this is not the reciprocity we are hearing in the announcement of yesterday. So I think that in a way we have also to wait to see what will be the concrete, if it will be a negotiation with the countries within agreements, or if there will be a complete how you say, jeopardizing completely the main rule of the WTO.
Can I push you a little bit on, and you said that I used the funeral. Let's continue the funeral metaphor. Why I think it is a funeral. Even if this is a negotiating tactic, it is a president whose view is that it is America's right to use tariffs as a negotiating tactic unilaterally whenever it feels like it. I think that is a given now. Whether or not he wants to move to a more tariff system-wide approach, the notion that the tariffs are a negotiating tactic unilaterally is not what the multilateral system is based on.
That's fair. But let me say that also trade has changed. What you are saying is true. We don't like it. It's not that I like it. So I prefer the second worst than the first worst. Because it will be different for the developing countries. It will be different for the world. But let me say that also the structure of trade has changed. 30% of trade today is South-South. 30%. Yes? 40% is North-South, South-North. Okay? And 30% is North-North. So there will be a 30% that will be very affected. But there is the South-South trade that has been the really growing part of trade in the last 2 decades. Yes? For the first time, South-South trade is so important. And if we think about the opportunities there, and I go to what the president said, the African Free Trade Area, for example, can add to the trade in Africa $3.4 trillion. Yes? And that depends on Africa. It doesn't depend on the US. You know, so the self-reliance of Africa is not only aid, it's also economic growth. You know, most of the population, young population, will be in Africa. They have a huge opportunity, and it will change the structure of the global economy. That's my point.
That's a really interesting point. And Mr. President, I'll turn to that because we spoke about it in the context of aid, and you mentioned it in trade. Let's talk about what this, and to use the phrase here, multipolarization, what is the new system that you would want to create, both for trade and aid, assuming that the US is doing what it's doing? What is everyone else going to need to do now?
Well, self-reliance is not only at the national level, but on the continental level. And there's good news coming out of Africa, like she said. Most countries have ratified the protocol on continental free trade in Africa. And that trade is beginning to grow steadily. We're able to export tariff-free into our countries. Of course, there are obstacles because our trade channels have been the colonial trade channels between us and Europe and not amongst ourselves. So one of the things we need to deal with first is how we develop the infrastructure to be able to exchange goods amongst ourselves. Already, most countries are allowing free movement of people. And so if we have free movement of goods and services across the continent, I think that it will fill a huge gap in South-South trade, and that will benefit all our countries.
And do you think that the actions of the Trump administration will accelerate Africans' determination to do this? Will it finally actually happen, the African Free Trade Area?
Definitely it will. Definitely we will learn to be more self-reliant as a continent and to trade more amongst ourselves because there's a lot of room there for expanding trade.
Is that something that you think would also happen with Brazil? That there would be extra efforts to have free trade areas with other groups, that there would be a focus, a sort of ex-US focus on trade links?
I think so. And I think, well, you, coming from Britain, would understand. The king is dead. Long live the king. So the question is, the question for us really is not so much to mourn about the old order, but to build the new order. And I think that the new order, the South-South cooperation, and maybe some South, some Northern countries also as well, that will That's what we're seeking. I mean, that's what's part of this multipolarization that is mentioned. Brazil, for instance, had opened it, had shut. I hope it will open again. For instance, an office of our agricultural reserves company in Ghana, in Accra, Embrapa. Yeah. You know. So I think we need much more of that. And let me say, again, coming back to the tariffs, what sounds very absurd to Brazil is that Brazil is one of the few big countries to which the United States has a surplus.
Yes.
So you cannot speak about, let us say, reciprocity. What's the reciprocity? Well, even reciprocity in the WTO, in the old GATT, it's not the same product. It has to be seen globally. So anyway, I'm very pessimistic about the old order, especially what we used to be called an rules-based order, but we didn't know who made the rules. And we go to an order which is really an international law order in which South-South cooperation will be much bigger.
But will it be, it may be rules-based, will it be a free trade world order? Because quite often the big southern players, including Brazil, but India, have not been terribly free trade focused. Are you saying you want to create a new order committed to free trade rules based? I'm coming to you in just a second, but
maybe I could give up to
No, I want to ask the Brazil perspective.
Brazil, I can say that. I was a negotiator, so it sounds self-serving, but I was, together with the British one who represented the European Union, then Peter Mandelson, were the two, and Pascal Lamy, of course, was the Director General, were the people who fought more strongly to keep the Doha route going. Unfortunately, it went away, but the real destruction of the world order in terms of trade, since you're saying, is the question of the appeal system, the dispute settlement system. So that's what would really put us in a position to challenge the United States without fighting it, just giving it to the judges. That's what I should do.
I just want to say that we don't have a free trade, even before Trump. Yes, what we had is an agreement of how we will behave, and we had consolidated tariffs, not free trade. Yes, that was part of the thing that the developing countries always said. You know, in agriculture, we didn't have free trade. We had problems in problems in access to markets that were very protective. And so in a way, you know, it's not, we don't want to maintain or to go to a free trade system that never existed. What we want is to have rules of the game, because I really believe that the uncertainty is one of the main difficult points that we have to face. You know, if the uncertainty will hold investment. And for the developing countries, it will be very bad, because not only trade will suffer, but also investment will suffer. And if we don't have trade and we don't have investment, we are already in a low growth normal. And so if growth suffer, then the developing countries will suffer.
So you want to create a South-South system of rules and stability, and one where you have in areas, for example, in Africa, greater focus on reducing barriers. That is an uplifting message to come out of this burning bridges conversation. Let's open it now, because I know there are lots of people who will have questions from the floor to see what the broad, and when the Foreign Minister arrives, we could ask his perspective. Yes, gentleman in the second row. Could you just wait for the microphone, I think, so that people can hear you?
I can't hear anything.
You hear?
Hello.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yes. I'm Ricardo La Coleta. I'm a journalist for the Brazilian newspaper Folha de São Paulo. I have a question to the President of Ghana. You mentioned that one of the consequences of the closure of USAID and the reduction of aid from the US might be a reduction of the US soft power. I'd like to ask if you see any international player today, I'm referring to China, willing to fill this gap, being more interest, for example, to increase its aid and therefore build its influence through international cooperation. Thank you.
Our cooperation with different segments of the world are specialized, and so with the US, it's been in governance, it's been in education, healthcare, and all that. Our cooperation with China is more in infrastructure and investments. And so building that road, building that railway. Our cooperation with India is in agriculture and agribusiness. With Brazil is with supply of agricultural equipment and machinery. And so, I mean, we have multifaceted international cooperation with different parts of the world. And so when I say US soft power, it's because US AID is very visible in Ghana. And the programs it runs, you know, are programs that project US as a caring nation. And so if we're able to close that gap and shut that out, we'll still have cooperation with different countries. Maybe some European nations might decide to step in and say, look, we're prepared to fill this gap. It's not too large. $156 million really is not a huge pot of money, but it buys US a lot of, you know, recognition for the work that it does. But we are prepared to fill that gap. And like I said, it must teach us to be more reliant. I believe that leadership counts. African nations must show leadership. I must say that we also have responsibility of as leaders of African countries to show that we can be less wasteful in how we spend our money, and we should be able to make those adjustments. I mean, just looking at the budget, there are many places that we can cut where we wasted resources before, that we can bring into areas that are of more priority than they have. So there's a responsibility on us to also make the kind of adjustments that help to fill gaps like that.
Can I just follow up on that very good question and ask whether you would be willing to have assistance from China in these kind of soft power areas, education, health, where it would be Chinese stickers that said instead of AID, and the soft power impact would be Chinese?
Well, I haven't seen China invest in those areas in many parts of Africa. I don't know if it's a policy they would decide to adopt, but for now, they might fail up at the multilateral level. I mean, if US decided to cut assistance to some of the UN organizations that are doing critical work in Africa, I mean, powers like China, India, and others might say, look, we're going to fill up to those gaps, but I don't see them going in individual countries into those particular areas.
Thank you. There was a question here.
Thank you very much. First, congratulations to our newly minted president of Ghana. And thank you for the things you said. I think that a reliant Africa is really what the world awaits. And so you exemplifying it by the way you have responded to what people think would be calamitous for Africa simply because the US decides to retreat is my way that I want to see African leaders take the stage on what's going on with geopolitics. Now, Zani, I love you. I like that you said it exactly as it is. The multilateral order we have now is dead. It is dead. It was dying, but we refused to acknowledge that. And while all the people outside of the supposed rules-based world were complaining, nobody was listening. There was basically a denial of the reality. Now we're forced to confront it. And I think that what's important is for us to agree that this is a moment for a design of what would enable us enjoy the collaborations and the cooperations that we know really helped the global prosperity that we saw for many decades, even this last century. There is an opportunity for a multilateral system, but it has to be a different kind of multilateral system. Well, Trump is forcing it on us to have that debate, and it has started here. That's why I love town halls.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Minister. I feel a little bad putting you on the spot like this, because you may not even have heard this wonderful intervention, but we've been talking about the impact of the shuttering of USAID. We've been talking about the tariff approach that the Trump administration has been taking. We've been talking, as the title of this session suggests, whether we're building or burning bridges. So I'm going to, this great question here I'm going to put to you, which is the multilateral order dead?
First of all, sorry for being late. The fog over Munich has delayed. Not at all. Not at all. It's existential that we keep it as alive as possible. First of all, because cooperation is always much more powerful than confrontation. Secondly, because we have a world that is more diverse than ever, which is very good. And of course, what we keep calling emerging countries that have emerged a long time ago, they're asking just their right place at the table. And thirdly, because there are global existential issues, climate emergency is the most evident ones, but development, now that we are going to the Finance for Development UN conference in Sevilla in June, in a few months, or how channeling correctly migration movements can only have a global approach. Therefore, what we have and what's needed is to reform the multilateral system, to make it more inclusive and to make it more effective. But we need it more than ever.
But we were discussing, and it is unfair on you to bring you into conversations that you were not part of, but we were discussing this, and the President made the point that this was a moment of opportunity for Africa to essentially focus more on itself and to use the opportunity of the shuttering of USAID to really look at what was essential and what was not essential, to focus on African trade. And so there is, I think, a sense of some optimism here that this big shock from the outside has, or from the biggest component of the international system, has actually shaken things up, but there are some good things from it. So for that, two questions. One, to what degree is Europe going to make up for the very real loss of resources that it seems the US is going to no longer put into the international system? And two, how actively will Europe push for thinking about a trading system that is a rules-based trading system when currently the current one is being blown up, basically?
The first thing about Europe is that we have never done things better than when we are confronted to pressure or to crisis. It's almost the European method. We have given the best of ourselves when we realize that we have to do a leap forward together and united. We know well Africa, they are our neighbors. For Spain, Western Sub-Saharan Africa are really our neighbors. And we realize that most of the challenges that we have as European societies, we can only tackle them if we do it jointly with Africa. We are already the first one in development aid in the world. The European Union, the Commission, plus the development aid of bilaterally of each member state. Spain has tripled in the last 3 years their development cooperation programs with Africa. And we are really adamant, we really believe in African integration. It's the right path. As European integration was the right path for development and for stability for ourselves. That's why we have a high-level dialogue with the African Union and with other regional integration African organizations. Spain has a very deep one with ECOWAS. And certainly, I think this is a moment of opportunities. I think it's a moment. And for Europe, this is nothing new. As I was saying at the beginning, it's confronted to crisis that we realize how much we are capable of doing on our own.
But is that, just to be specific, is that already happening? I mean, funds have been cut off, programs are shuttering. Is Europe going to step up and say, right, we are going to put in more, we're going to take on the mantle of soft power that USAID had?
I hope so. I cannot talk on behalf of all European Union. Spain is already doing it. We haven't waited to this moment. As I was telling you, we have tripled our development aid programs and we have doubled our emergency aid to Africa. And certainly Spain will push forward for that. It's development aid, but it's also interesting the private sector in Africa, and it's having a high-level political dialogue. For Europe, Africa is not a concept. It's a reality. And the development of Africa and working together with Africa, it's a part of how we can solve our own future that in a part is joined with the Africans.
Zani?
Yes.
And there's a blowback. The Trump playbook is still playing out, and so we want to see where it heads towards. But I was just reading, U.S. farmers are beginning to complain because USAID was the biggest mopper of excess food for food aid to Africa. And USAID is not doing the auctions that mops up the excess U.S. food. And so the U.S. farmers are complaining. But it's an opportunity for Africa to increase food production. And so if that aid stops coming, we would do the investments that are necessary to make our farmers more productive so that we can establish food security in Africa instead of waiting for those US aid handouts to come.
Thank you. There was a number, there's a question there, it's right in the back there. Let's get that one. I'm going to try and get a couple more questions in. Go ahead.
So my question goes to the minister. Especially related to European dialogue or conversation that is going on right now. So I think there is a sense that some European leaders want to ride on the cocktail of Trump and, ignite European nationalism to some extent. So I wanted to ask, is there a way in which the EU and Spain you are willing to stand up for a world order in which global thinking it's married with a sense of national security, but at the same time there is that core link over there, or are we likely to see an Europe that increasingly becomes inward looking?
Selfish nationalism is the opposite of European values. Europe was built to avoid war on European soil and to fight against that selfish nationalism that was opposed to the selfish nationalism of your neighbor. So Europe can only exist as an open society. If we change that, we are changing Europe. And that means that tolerance, pluralism, diversity, democracy, or democratic values at the end is the essence of Europe. I'm not naive. I'm very well aware that in every European society, in mine as well, in Spain, far right-wing political parties and forces are growing. And they are proposing something that is completely opposite to what has given us the longest decades of stability, prosperity, peace in Europe, and that is very much linked to open society. And that has a translation to how we relate to the outside world. For European Union, because we are an open society, nothing more normal than belief in free trade. In multilateralism, European Union is a multilateralist creation. To believe in United Nations and in the United Nations Charter, and to believe that peaceful relations with others, cooperation, it's always, as I was saying, stronger than confrontation. And there is something paradoxical. All these far right-wing political forces, they claim that they are very nationalistic, but they are all the time receiving foreign interference and foreign influence. And I'm very clear to the Spanish people always and to the Europeans, this goes against their own interest. Because if we defeat the open society that we are, if we defeat tolerance, pluralism, democracy, we are not only defeating philosophical ideas or beautiful values, that's the very basis of how we behave and what is the engine of our prosperity and our stability here in Europe, and how we can promote prosperity and stability in the rest of the world.
Thank you. Gentleman here, front row.
Thank you. I do long-term forecasting on African issues, and The Economist, in actual fact, recently quoted quite a bit of our research on the growing gap between for example, GDP per capita in Africa versus GDP per capita in the rest of the world. Basically, what's happening, things are improving, but Africa is falling further and further behind. And also, to quote The Economist, you've written extensively about the extent that we're in an era of slowbalization, not globalization. The myth of free trade lifts all boats, I think, is under question. So most aid went to low-income countries, and it has made a dramatic, it is still important. It reduces poverty. The reduction in US aid, the volumes that we are seeing is going to increase poverty. More people are going to die. It is a real crisis on the continent. At a time that our population growth is expanding, population levels are, education is rising, and so on and so forth. So what we see in West Africa, the instability, reflects the kind of developmental challenge. So, you know, you tend to argue that free trade, all that we need to do is unlock private capital. Private capital doesn't come to low-income countries. What is your solution?
Well, luckily, I'm the moderator of this panel, so I'm not going to take time away from our distinguished guest, but I disagree with you. Lady behind you.
Hi, I'm Shir Fine-Grossman, CEO of Israel-Africa Relations Institute, a new think tank. And I wanted to ask about the increasing role of private sectors. I think there is a massive opportunity now with what's happening to incentivize them. So how are you and other African nations intend to do that?
That's one for you.
Yeah, okay. The drivers of poverty do not only have to do with capital and trade, but we shouldn't forget the issue of climate change. A lot of what is happening in the Sahel that is affecting people's livelihoods is climate change. Unfortunately, Africa is facing the most adverse impact of it, even though it contributed the least to it. And so the Lake Chad has shrunk to 20 times smaller than it used to be. All the families that depended on the Lake Chad for their livelihoods have become displaced, and they're migrating southwards into the coastal countries. That is leading to clashes between herders and agriculturists. It's a more complex situation than just being able to trade and where capital comes from. But I believe that we must build resilience, and that's where the private sector comes in. We before had believed in state-led development. I think that increasingly the African private sector is leapfrogging with the new technologies, with digitalization and all that. And we must open that space for them to be able to drive economic progress. And so you're right.
So I know there are more questions, but we are running out of time. And I wanted to give one last chance for our panelists to leave you with a concluding thought, because I think this has been really interesting. It's been a panel that has acknowledged the scale of the shock, but really you've laid out opportunities that can be grabbed from it. So could you just leave with perhaps a minute each, our audience, both the live stream audience here, with what you hope to see in, let's say, the coming year that would show that this is going to be a moment where opportunity is grasped rather than that we all throw our hands in the air. And maybe, Rebecca, I'll start with you.
Yeah, can I say 4 tweets?
Tweets? Well, it depends how many characters they are, but yes, okay.
My first tweet is that private sector will go to Africa if the multilateral development banks do what they have to do. It wouldn't come alone. They will need to crowd in private capital for private capital to go to the developing countries. If not, it won't happen. When you try only for the private sector to go alone, is very little money. So if you want to scale up, you have to take risk. Multilateral development banks have to come in. Second, you have to have a system for debt restructuring, because debt is a real problem, and it's a problem for development. And my third point is that you need a trade system that is able to have the flexibilities that the world needs today. So instead of throwing the rules down the drain, we need to reform the trade system too.
That's 3 tweets. So give me one thing that you expect or would like in the next year that would signal we're going in the right direction.
I would like FFD4, the Financing for Development conference, for Europe really to come together to help us in the final consensus that we need for FFD4, building on the Pact of the Future.
Thank you. Sasa Amorim.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I agree almost entirely what Rebecca said. I'm not so confident on the finance for development, but I won't explain why. I think Europe is a story of free trade inside, but not necessarily a free trade outside. We had I'm not speaking of Spain, but I'm speaking more generally. One of the things that are making difficult the European Union Mercosur agreement is the protectionism of one of the countries, which I love, but it's true. I have to say that way. And finally, I think if I would make a summary, what we really need is a new global governance, a global governance that reflects the world of today, not the world of 1945. I mean, what we have today is the same thing as if in the beginning of the 20th century you followed the rules of the Vienna Conference, of the Vienna Congress. So we are totally out. This is true of the World Bank, this is true of IMF, this is true of the United Nations. So I think what we have, which is the closest thing to an adequate, representative and effective forum, is the G20. It has to be a little more African and a little less European. If that's so, we'll have a very good system.
That's the building block of the new system. But it still includes the United States, so it's not just South-South. You next, Foreign Minister.
I hope it will be the year in which we will see alliances to be created. And Sevilla and the Finance for Development UN conference a very good moment. Alliances, of course, between what we call today the Global South and what we can call the Western world. Alliances between the public sector and the private sector. And alliances around things that can seem like evidence, but we see that in today's world are not evidence. An alliance around peace, an alliance around development and the way Africa can access to finance.
And will those alliances include the US?
I hope so. It's a big country and the natural ally of European Union.
Seems to be going in a slightly different direction right now. Mr. President, the last word is yours. What are you looking for in the next year?
I see trade growing exponentially amongst African countries. And I believe that Africa has the human resource. We have young, bright people who are willing to grab innovation. And we need the leadership to drive that energy to make our countries prosper. But I do believe, as a student of psychology, that in all adversity there's opportunity, and new orders spring out of disruption. The disruption that is taking place now is going to yield a new order because we'll have to adapt to what is happening.
That seems an appropriate place to end on. The disruption that is happening now will yield a new order. Thank you very much.